Darla Harris is pretty much an expert on ferns. But one thing I wanted to share when I was just doing extra research so I could understand ferns a little bit more before this talk, I read on Wikipedia, so you know it's true, that if you can find a flower on a fern, you are guaranteed, and that's what it said, guaranteed to have happiness and wealth for the rest of your life. So we'll have to ask Darla if she's ever come across that. Okay, Darla will talk about Texas ferns found in our area, as well as their history and propagation. She has grown ferns for over 40 years and has grown over 650 types of ferns. She is president of the Texas Gulf Coast Fern Society, editor of American Fern Society Fiddlehead Forum. She opened Plantation Nursery in 2015 and offers more than 200 different ferns for sale. So Darla, welcome to our chapter, and it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. So hopefully everybody is growing ferns already. In answer to your question, one of the taxonomic things of a fern is it does not berry, it does not flower. So it does not put off any seeds. It totally grows from spore. So much for our forever happiness, I guess. We'll have to get it a different way.
Very good.
Thank you for having me. Getting to the history of ferns, they date back more than 70 million years. And science knows that because of the fossil record. And I don't know how many of you guys actually mess with the fossils, but I was going to show you some of the fossils. These are found in the US. So this is slate. So this was embossed and it's kind of a little chalk. So these are actually found in the United States up in the area of the Illinois. They also have these little nodules that they dig up, they're clay, and they freeze them and heat them up and freeze them and they crack them open. And when you crack them open, some of them have ferns, some of them have other type of ancestral plants and whatnot. And an interesting piece from Brazil is a petrified tree fern. So this is a cross section of a tree fern. But the interesting thing in it is, if you look in the center there, that's another thing that makes a fern a fern. It is the first vascular plant on the phylogeny chain. So like she was discussing the mushrooms, we share spore with them, but they do not have a vascular system. So the lycophytes and the ferns are the only ones on the phylogeny chain there that do spore produce. After that, you get your conifers, you're going to have your seeds there, and then on to your angiosperms where you're flowering with seeds. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth on actually growing from spore a little later in the program. Okay, so we're going to discuss ferns of Texas, but that will work in our Houston area. This area is really not that many ferns, to be real honest with you. This book is fairly new out. It was done by BRIT, the Botanical Institution of Texas, up in Dallas. And it's a very comprehensive book on ferns and the lycophytes of Texas. It also tells you per county what ones are growing there. And one of the most difficult talks I gave, and this was in person, was to the Brazoria County Master Gardeners, and it was for credit. So they had to have 2 hours of talking about ferns of their county. They have 8. So that really made it an interesting overview. When you talk about the size of Texas, it's 131 miles roughly from Beaumont to El Paso. And then when you're looking at Brownsville up to Stafford, you're looking at 875 miles. But the really interesting thing, you've got your whole Gulf Coast area, which we really kind of fall closer into that than any of the other true areas. As far as elevation, we really go from like sea level essentially up to almost 8,800 feet in the Guadalupe Park there. So we're broken down into 10 areas geographically for fern growing. So we have our piney woods, We have our Gulf prairies and marshes, our post oak savannas, the blackland prairies, cross timbers and prairies, South Texas plains, Edwards Plateau, rolling plains, the high plains, and the Trans-Pecos, which is your mountain and basins area. The interesting thing about this is we have like 128 different ferns in Texas. And you can see how these areas are all broken out as far as the different plains. So we're down in this area. Right here is your piney woods area. So those would be our closest two areas that really grow well for us. Now, as far as the number of ferns, when you talk East Texas, you're looking at 62 species. So that's your woodland areas. But when you come over here and you get into your Edwards Plateau, you've actually got 63 species there. And that's your Austin area and all your limestone rock. So it's a really more deserty area. And then you get over into Trans-Pecos area and you actually have the most species there. And it really wiped that out. It's like 63 species. I'm sure with you guys being a native plant society, you've probably been up to the Little Thicket. They actually have almost all of the piney woods ferns located on their 80 acres there. Fern Society did our field trip there again this past spring and just making sure everything is still looking good. And it is. So this book here is the ferns of the Trans-Pecos. So if you're interested in the more xerophytic type ferns, this is a fantastic little book. There we go, 80 species in the Trans-Pecos area. So it's pretty amazing because I always think of ferns, well, before I became a fern person anyway, as being more woodland type environment. And you really don't think of ferns as being aquatic and bogs and deserts and epiphytics and everything that's possible. So these are going to start into some of the ferns that do well in our area, but I'm going to warn you, a lot of these are non-trade plants. So I will point out to you the ones that you can pick up and trade. The Woodwardia virginicum, it's a beautiful fern and it was in trade for probably about 15 years. I actually found it fairly difficult to grow. It is very common in the big thicket area, but I never seen it in the little thicket at all. And the further west, I'm up in Magnolia. So we are right on the border of the piney woods and the Waller area, which is really just nothing, cedars. Close up on the Virginia chain fern. So it's a nice dainty woodland fern. It grows by rhizome underground, and it kind of pops up a few inches to a few feet away from the parent plant. So it's very sporadic growing. It doesn't make a very thick carpet of ferns. Woodwardia aurelata is a more of a bog type fern. If you go up to the Little Thicket, you will see them all along the little creek areas. Again, these are not in the trade. They do have to be grown from spore or from division. So more of these I'm growing. So this is a whole patch of them. You can see how they really do really nice. They get very full. They spread very well. They're a rhizome. Very pretty plant. I really like them. Their nickname is the netted chain fern. So you can see here on the back of the leaf how all the veins are very netted. And that's one way you tell them apart then from the sensitive fern, which is your Onoclea sensibilis. Because just looking at the leaf shape, they look very, very similar. The Onoclea is a little bit narrower. They grow in the same type of habitat near little creeks and waterways. They prefer a little bit more shade. Now the aurelata, the Woodwardia, the frame before, we actually have growing up in our area. We've got 22 acres up here in Magnolia, and we've got about 7 native ferns here on our property. But the sensitive fern is not one of them. So this is the maidenhair fern. This is Aethianum capillus veneris. This is Southern Maiden. Now, Southern Maiden does well for us here, even though we tend to be a little bit more acidy, and it really prefers alkaline soil. So if you are wanting to grow this, it works best if you'll plant it around your slabs, your walkways that are concrete, around those concrete bird baths. That way they can actually leach out the alkalinity, the lime, out of those objects, or you can just supplement them if you want to use some dolomite lime. But it's a lovely fern. It does not typically like our summers, so it's often will go dormant. It will also freeze down. So it's really a spring and fall plant a lot of times. This one is in the trade. I do carry it all the time, so it's an easy plant to get. Now this, a friend of mine just texted me the picture from France, and it was growing on the cliff walls there in southern France, and she thought that was pretty cool. So it is worldwide distribution. One thing with ferns is a lot of them are spread all over the world, the same plant. But then we are now finding with DNA that some of the ones that have the same name, we're finding aren't as closely related as they once thought they were. So I've got a couple coming forward in the program here that I'll talk more in depth on that. But the Atianum here seems to be the same plant everywhere where it's growing. Okay, this is the cinnamon fern. So it's Osmundus, and these are its spore. So they put these big, tall, cinnamon-looking spore pattern out in the spring. They're green spore, so that means they're not viable very long. They have to be put down within about 2 weeks, or it's too old to mature. So it's really amazing that it has to fall on just the perfect conditions in order to germinate and make other plants. So it prefers creeky type areas, so boggier, a little wetter. The wetter it is, the more sun it can take. If it's a little drier conditions where you're just watering it regular, then it needs to be a little bit more shaded. For those that have never seen a cinnamon fern in person, it's quite large fern. So it's a clumping fern. It's a single plant, and it can get 3.5, 4 foot tall. So each frond, and it makes kind of a vase-like cylinder shape to it. It's a very attractive plant. Now this, I'm sure with some of the other natives, you've run across things that are a little harder to grow. So sometimes they do them in tissue culture. This plant will not tissue culture. It has to be spore grown. So it is in the trade, and I do carry it. This is Osmundus regalis sensibilis. Okay, this is the American royal fern. This is one that in, probably the last 10, maybe 15 years, it got renamed. It had been just Osmundus regalis. Well, it wasn't as closely related to the European royal fern, so they got to keep Osmundus regalis regalis, and ours changed to Osmundus regalis specibilis. So you do have to watch the labeling and kind of know your plant to make sure you're getting one of the natives and not just one of the similar ones. So this is a picture of its spore pattern. Again, it's like the cinnamon fern, pushes off in early spring. It goes right up the middle, and it again is green spore. So it's very short lifespan, and also is grown from spore only, not from tissue culture. So, and this is also in the trade. So Pteridium aquinum, which is the bracken fern. So the bracken fern is a very unique fern. It's another one of those worldwide distribution ferns. And there is one in Japan that looks a little different, but so far it's falling under the same name. So as DNA reaches out more and more, they'll start dividing these more out. This is the fern that got famous in England a few years back with mad cow disease. It has never truthfully been pinned down that this is what was causing it. The interesting thing about this and a few other ferns is this will take out the impurities out of the soil. So it's an aggressive spreading type plant. It takes over, I think in England, they say it takes several acres a day in growth with an established set of them. We do have it up in the big thicket area. I don't recall seeing it in the little thicket though. It is not a trade plant. So if you were to want to grow it, you would really have to just find collection of it somewhere. So it's not sold. Makes a pretty plant though. Okay, Botricium. So this is one in my yard, the Bidernatum. They are a small little fern. They only get up about 8 inches tall. They travel underground. They produce their spore, and it has to end up in the dark. So before it will ever make a new plant. It's very, very difficult to grow from spore. It's very, very picky. It's very sporadic. When you find one, you may find the next one 20 feet away. And it's rather difficult to find. Now, once you get your eye set to see them, you can see them pretty easy. They just put their spore up just once a year, but it lasts a long time. So the pattern on it stays and you get to enjoy the look of it. Here's what it looks like. So you'll see them once they put their spore, they're a lot easier to identify at that point instead of that little tuft of fern down at the bottom of the base. So these are usually easiest to find over winter. They do tend to be more evergreen. They will take floods. Our area where we have them here at the house is an area that is in the 100-year floodplain. So we do get water on it typically, a few times a year other than our drought seasons, which it survives the droughts too. It's nowhere where we can water them. So we go check on them periodically and make sure they're still there. Dainty little leaf. So this is another one, Asplenium platineuron. This is also grown on our property. It is not a trade plant. The Botricium was not a trade plant. Again, you'd have to grow from spore. Now this one is growable from spore division. So hopefully in the next couple of years, I'll start carrying this one. It's really attractive little fern. It gets up about 10 inches or so tall, maybe 12. And it makes little clumps. So it's, again, we'll have like a 2-foot spacing before you get another clump of it. And it'll eventually fill in an area fairly nicely. All through the little thicket, the big thicket, you can see these really all through the piney woods areas, not down south. So this is just to show the spacing. Sorry, some of these did not migrate over very clear. So this is another Asplenium. This is trichotomines. So this one stays a lot shorter. It mimics a maidenhair look. Small plant, only getting up about maybe 8 inches tall. Kind of tucks its way around. It actually usually is closer to the more disturbed areas, like where your roads have been put in or trails. It is usually not under the trees. It's more on the edges. So it likes more light than some of the deeper forest type ferns. Again, it's not in the trade. So this is Anemia mexicana. Now this is, they call it the flowering fern because of its spore pattern. You can see how they push up nice and big. They stay a long time. Again, this is a smallish plant. It only gets up about 15 inches tall or so. And then you have the little spore shoots that actually come out of the leaf where your osmundus, your cinnamon fern, your royal fern, they actually come up just from the root system. These are actually on the fern leaf itself. So they just jut out of it. Now I have found that this one is not as cold hardy as I thought it would be. With the freeze of 2021, these did not come back for me. So, which surprised me since they are really more in line with your central Texas, and they typically are colder than we are. So I'm not real sure if it was the amount of snow and ice that we had. I have some more out. We'll see what they do this year. But so far, I'm kind of iffy on them. Now, this is Blechnum appendilatum. This is a pretty fern. This is in the trade. It puts off all of its new foliage and red. So you can see it does space out until it really has been an established clump for quite some time. But the new foliage constantly coming out red, going to darker. It gets up about 15 inches tall. I think it's a very attractive fern. This one also has a very large distribution area. You'll also see it all through the Caribbean area. It's native of Florida. They call it the hammock fern. It is native of Texas. Definitely worth looking at. It's an easy fern to grow, and it came back really easy after the bad freeze we had. Didn't knock it down at all. Takes our heat good, took the drought well. This is a bed that we do water, but it was still oppressively hot this last year. Close up. Okay, so this is one of the true woodland ferns. This is a Dryopteris. This one, once it's established, can get about 4 foot tall. It is a rhizomerous type grower, so it will spread, but it's not an aggressive spreader. So it will spread through the yard. It likes to be shaded. It can take partial really well. It does not want direct sun. It does not want total darkness. So if you've got a live oak that's this really dense underneath it, not one of the better candidates in a woodland fern. So this one likes a little more airiness than that. So definitely nice. It is in the trade. You can see it has just a really typical fern pattern.
Darla, there is a question in chat.
Okay.
Deborah asks, at Rice University, ferns grow all over the tree branches.
We're getting there.
Okay, we will wait.
Okay, it's coming, I promise. Debbie, this one's yours. This is Thalepteris kunzii. So this is southern wood fern. This one is a spreading fern, where the Dryopteris was a slower spread. This one can be an aggressive spreader. So if you have a larger area that you would like to cover fairly quickly, this will do it. The other nice thing is, even though it goes down for winter, it will pop up as soon as we warm up again. And if we get another freeze, and it'll go down, but it'll pop right back up again. So it doesn't wait till spring. A lot of the ferns, once they experience the cold, they wait till spring to reemerge. This one isn't one of them. It's quite happy to be growing, so it wants to continue. Okay, here you go. This is Pleopeltis polypollinoides. So this is the resurrection fern that you see growing on typically your live oaks. It is a selective fern on which trees it will grow on. It grows on our walnut tree up here. It does grow on a few elms. It likes a heavier bark type tree typically. I've never seen it grow like on a sweet gum, any of those type of really slicker trees. It resurrects into this once it has a nice little rain. It is nearly impossible to transplant, and growing it from spore is a challenge. So for it to be so prolific in the trees, it is very hard-headed where it comes to man trying to duplicate it. So we have been successful one time getting it transplanted into sphagnous moss. And we took a very thin layer of the bark that had come off a tree where it had died and put that in a wire container and then put moss behind it. And my husband did the whole container, and he had one spot that made it. So it's been growing about 2 years, and it finally has inched along about an inch. And so we know it's taken hold. Everything else is gone. So that's just that one little spot made it. But it's a very interesting plant. There are several resurrection type plants in Texas, a lot through Central and West Texas. They have to have that defense system for the changing climate. So these will just, protect itself by curling up until the next rain, and then they will open up again.
How long can they stay dormant, so to speak?
Good question. I don't know. We went months. We went 2 months up here without water this year. So we got no rain in June or July at our house. And they came back as soon as we got a rain. They were all full out. So how many years, how many months? I really couldn't tell you for sure. but they do have a rhizome, and that's what this is a picture of, is its rhizome. And typically, if you look at the bark really closely, it's nestled itself up right where that really heavy bark has its little concaves, which I guess, and again, helps protect it because it would shade it from any sunlight that would hit towards it. Even though the fronds themselves would get sun, the rhizome itself does not. Plus, with the bark like it is, it works like little channels. So when it does rain or you get a heavy dew and it lands on the tree, it's going to tend to go into those channels and make sure those rhizomes are very watered. It's nature at its best.
Jennifer asked, is there a fern that will spread under a live oak? Nothing really grows well under hers.
There are a few. Well, the problem of it is most of them aren't native. So I'm having to go through my mind here and think of the native ones that will do better for you. I grow a lot of ferns. I do find some of the non-natives are actually better for our climate than our native ones, because we're, again, such a big state that just because it grows in our state doesn't mean it's going to like our area at all. This one is the Christmas fern. So it was a good segue to the next plant here. Christmas ferns are typically an evergreen. That's part of the reason they got their name, and they will grow in denser areas. So when you say your live oak and it's really dense, how low is the lowest limb? Is it like at 4 foot? Is it lower than 4 foot? You know, are you getting any peripheral sun at all? That makes a big difference because most ferns need some sunlight to do photosynthesis, as well as your other plants, is why you're having problems there. Okay, it's not the best photo here to show it, but if you look right here, you can see how the leaf structure is really just really kind of straight down. And then you have this little jut out, and it does that on all of the little fronds here, the little pinny. That is what they really say is the reason it got its name as the Christmas fern, because if you turn that sideways, it looks like a sleigh. So they say it's either because it's evergreen during the winter holidays, or it's because the leaf is shaped like a sleigh. Who knows? A lot of folklore. This one would be a good candidate to try. So out of all of the others, let's see. No, those first 2 or 3, but they're hard to locate. Onoclea, if you're watering the area really well, that sensitive fern takes really dense light. The areolata would work, it's just harder to locate. So where sensitive fern is in the trade, and easier to come by. Let's see, what else do we have? This is a naturalized fern. This is the climbing fern, Lygodium japonicum. It has been naturalized in the state since before the 1950s. It was in the Texas Fern book written back in 1953. So it's been here for a long time. There's one thing about spores and dispersal is they catch the jet stream and they can travel long way. I mean, if you consider Hawaii and their flora there, as far as their ferns, I mean, it was an atoll. It was, just a lava rock that made an island. And all the spore came in from the areas south of them and dropped its spore, and they became very prolific with all kinds of different ferns there. But they were not native of that island because it was not anything but, lava rock when it cooled off. So that's true with a lot of ferns throughout the world. So the japonicum is not as invasive as some of the lygodiums. The lygodiums over in Florida is a different type. Part of the problem with Florida as well is they don't typically freeze, where we typically have at least one good freeze a year, and this knocks it completely back down to the ground again. So this is growing on our property. It was here when we bought the property. I have only seen it climb up like yo palms up to maybe 10 foot, and it never seems to ever get a chance to get above that. So it's not ever going to climb up the pine trees or the elms or the oaks and cause them to catch fire unless our weather pattern changes drastically. It does spread from spore, so it does spread pretty easily. A lot of people like the plant. I have it, but I do not sell it. Okay, Macroteleptus teresiana is also another fern that has naturalized here in Texas, another one that was in the 1953 book. It's really a lovely fern. In fact, it's my husband's favorite fern. So it can take quite a bit of sun. It doesn't have to have it though. It can take quite a bit of shade. It's a clumping fern, so you don't have, if you've got a small space and you don't want it taking over an area, it's good for that. It's a large fern. The fronds on these can be about 2.5, 3 foot long. It is a clumping fern, so it is just that single plant, but you can see how thick the stems, the stipes are to support all of the size of the fronds. It does usually freeze back in the winter, but it comes back again in the spring. Fairly heavy water. One thing I have noticed growing ferns, it seems like the larger the leaves are on them, the more water they need, which stands to reason, like your cinnamon fern we showed at the beginning is a bog plant. It's a big plant. It needs all that extra moisture to keep it sustained. Now, this one has turned out to be a problem one. This is the Our Lady fern. So it's Atherium felix femina. This is widely sold in the trade. It is tissue cultured and it's European. So they are doing DNA on them now. This next frame, this is our native. This was taken at the Little Thicket. You can see it looks totally different. It's not as lacy. It's not as ovate. It's not as tall as the European one. So come to find out, as they're doing the testing on all these throughout the United States and Canada, they've discovered that we actually have 7 different lady ferns, and they're all different. So they're getting ready to rename them all. So what this one will be coming forward, I do not know its name yet. I just know that the one that's in trade is not the right one. Now I have collected spore off this, also the red stemmed lady fern that is also from the Little Thicket. So we will have both of those at the nursery here in the next couple of years anyway. Nice fern, very, very nice fern. It can take quite a bit of shade. It grows around the creek beds, but not down into the water. So it really isn't a heavy thirsty fern, but it does grow close. So that way it does at least get, periodic water. So that's a close up of the blades with look like. I was quite disappointed because I inadvertently, of course, I've only just learned this in November, that the local ones were actually European and had sold the Memorial Conservancy several for Memorial Park. And now I feel a little guilty. It was innocent sell, but now we got to get them straightened out and get them onto the actual native. And this is its spore pattern. It's a black spore. It lasts a long time. And as with your mushrooms, she was talking about the spore patterns are part of the identifying factor on ferns as well. So that's part of what puts things into different groupings, is the way the spore patterns work. Okay, this is Equisetum emilia. It actually is a fern, has no leaves. I'm sure you guys have seen it. It's horsetail fern. It grows up around Huntsville, very dense areas, very wet areas. It's a definite bog fern. It does spread. It puts down very deep roots. If you get it, you plant it, count on the roots going down maybe as far as 12 foot. It's extremely difficult to eradicate. It's kind of like bamboo. You can't get rid of it. You got to either keep it potted and contained or put it in like a concrete container, that you've sunk to where it just can't keep going, because it does spread by rhizomes. But this is one of those ferns that they really hated to call it a fern for a lot of years. They really wanted it to be an ally, but DNA proved it was actually a fern. Okay, this is Marcellia. This is Marcopoda. It's clover, bog fern. You'll find it in the waterways. This is one of the ones that was down in Brazoria. Beautiful fern as well, and potted, like a clay pot set down in a water bowl. It folds up at night. It goes to sleep. So the little leaves one side will fold into the other side and it will go to sleep and then wakes up in the morning and opens up. Can take full sun, doesn't have to have full sun, has to have the water though. It will dry out. It pretty much grows. There's even some that grows up above Austin, up in some of the concave waterways up there on the top of the hills that catch the water when it rains, but will dry up. They have it up there growing. And what will happen is if it starts getting too little of water, it will start pushing off its little spore caps. And that way it protects itself from going extinct. So if the main plant dies, it's already forewarned itself that, be ready, you're going to have to keep us going. If it's happy and it's always in a continuously damp to wet area, you almost never see the spore caps. So it does reproduce by just spreading out. If you have it in a pond, like a pot put in a pond, it will grow out over the top of the water, but it's just on stems. So it's not like it's gotten loose or anything. It will get a little more length to it and fill over. It's pretty. There's 2 or 3 of them that are native to Texas. I like them. So you can occasionally find them in the trade. I know I carry a few, not a whole bunch though.
A question that refers to the Marsilia.
Mhm.
There is a non-native invasive species that looks like Marsilia, but it is fuzzy. It is spreading all over Houston.
Yeah.
And she suggests that if you see it, don't throw it in your pond until you are sure it is the native.
I think that you're talking about Salvania molesta is what I believe she's making reference to. It's kind of an oval shaped little water plant, and it is a fern, and it will double in size every, 3 days or something. So if you end up with 500 plants there and you double it in 3 days, you've got a lot real quick. So it has gotten into some of the waterways. I know Lake Conroe had it up in their lake. They've been trying different methods of controlling it. Cold weather does not control it. They have brought in some different types of critters to see if they can get it attacked well enough, some type of beetles. Bad thing about some of our remedies, we end up with it kind of biting us on the other side when you get an invasive bug then because you're trying to get rid of an invasive plant. But yes, exactly. I do not grow Salvania. I had it in the past. And boy, if it ever takes hold in a soil area, you will never get rid of it. So it really is really tough. Okay, this is a Zola, Carolina. This one is a native of Brazoria County and other areas here. Now, I actually grow a Zola. I find it very interesting little plant. I have it in a container that cannot get into any of the waterways anywhere. It's high up on the property. And it's in a container that if, when it rains in it, the bottom fills up and overflows, where the part where the Zola is never overflows. So it's just kind of a play there. It turns red in the winter months when it gets cold. It's a very pretty green. They call it the mosquito fern because it does grow a very thick mat, as you can tell here. But the interesting thing about this fern is it actually has a lot of benefits to it. You can see it's the smallest fern in the world. You can see its little root systems there. So it's just, like those are probably 3/4 of an inch long. This is a magnified picture. So each little plantlet is smaller than your little fingernail, but it's a high nitrogen plant. They use it in a lot of the rice paddies, like in Asia, because they flood the fields. They let this go down the middles and it naturally fertilizes all the rice and it helps them with the nitrogen. The other thing, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Azolla event. This was supposedly occurred up around Greenland during the last ice age that we had. And it was killed out then. So before then, it was fresh water around Greenland. this was actively growing there, and they discovered it in core samples. And this little fern here actually eats carbon out of the air. So they think that it in part has helped with the greenhouse effect and started changing the environment. So in the Netherlands, they're actually studying this heavily to see if it's something that they want to encourage to try to help us out with some of the different weather patterns. Interesting plant. So this is a Selaginella. This is actually a lycophyte. This is another resurrection type fern. If you ever traveled off through, say, New Mexico or Arizona and stop at any of the little Stuckies or some of the little roadside cafe type places, they usually would sell these, and they're all dried out. And then you could take it home and you could put it in water and it would slowly resurrect itself. And it ends up getting a total bright green. And if you keep it wet, it'll stay. But this is also grown in Central Texas, and you can find it over there. I've never found it. I've never looked for it over there. The only ones I ever had were the ones that I ended up getting at the little stores in Arizona. Interesting, especially as a kid watching it. Okay, this is Pelea ovata. This is another fern that you'll find over in the hill country. This is really an awesome, pretty fern. So this is what the new growth looks like. This plant gets up about 2.5, 3 foot tall. It is very cold hardy, heat tolerant. It is drought tolerant. It's a nice little fern. So I started it from spore. So this is some of the gametophytes. The gametophyte is the first stage of actual getting a plant. So you have your starter stage is your spore, and then you sow it. Most ferns go through a life cycle where they actually have a fertilization period, where each of the little gametophytes here, each of these little heart-shaped areas, actually have male and female components that actually have to fertilize to make a sporophyte, a new fern. Peleas, on the other hand, actually are one of the ones that skip the sexual stage. So each of the spore is kind of like a mother fern. So it is a plantlet once it takes hold. So these are already past, they're already beginning little plants. And this is a tray of them. That's the same tray 2 months later. So you can see that they're putting off their leaves and getting ready to be all separated and bumped up into containers. It's a nice plant. I'm excited to get this out. I think it's going to be one that people are really going to love. It does well in our area. It can take really low humid days and take really hot humid days. A friend of mine who has since passed, she was Barbara Jo Hosasaki, who wrote the Fern Growers Manual back in 2000. And her husband was in the military and stationed over in the Waco area. And she collected some of this there. And they were from LA area. So she took it back. And the plant has lived from the 1950s all the way up until just the last few years. She passed away in 2012. And the plant declined after that and died. But the spore off these are actually from her plant. So it's kind of a special thing. She was a good friend. We also have coming along, this is another Pelea. So this is Pelea apuparia. As you can tell, it gets its name from its purple stems. So another plant that I got down in spore that is doing quite well and should be ready next year. Well, no, this is next year already, ready this year. This is an example of what they're looking at like right now. These are a very fast grower, so these will go ahead and grow up. I know the leaf doesn't look anything like what the picture was just there, but this is first leaves and they're not the true look. That's me. For anybody that's interested in anything or any questions on ferns or any ferns that are not of Texas origin.
I have a question. Through
Sure.
all this, you have really not mentioned any other critter species, insect benefiting from ferns. Are they really so uninviting to the rest of the plant kingdom, animal kingdom?
They've been around all these years and no, they're not really, I mean, they're not toxic. The deer come through and eat mine. They are edible. They're non-toxic. I mean, different ones of them are sold as food. The ostrich fern up in Maine, they're sold as a commodity to eat in the spring. There's a diplasium, that's another vegetable fern that's Asian of origin, again, another edible one. So neither one of those grow in Texas. So I didn't talk about them. We don't have anything here that's a consumption type food for people. Critters eat them. I mean, they don't bloom, so they're not going to have bees and whatnot on them. So that's not their function. They do take up, negatives out of the soil. They are excellent with erosion control. They help in a lot of areas.
I always think of people having to keep ferns really moist and misting them and all that, but it doesn't sound like that's what you were saying about the ones you grow.
Actually, most ferns, unless they're a bog fern or an aquatic fern, usually die a slow death from overwatering.
Oh.
So especially maidenhair ferns. Most people think that they grow along the creeks, and they do, but they're up on the rocks. They're not on any soil whatsoever. They're just sitting on a rock. So they get high humidity, which they really like, but we can provide high humidity here. But when we put them in soil, then we got to be careful not to overwater them, because that's not what they want. They do not want wet feet. Most ferns do not want wet feet. And unless they're just a huge leafed fern or a very aggressive growing fern, they really don't want overwatered. So like the Telepterus kunzii that I showed earlier is one of the woodland ferns that's a very aggressive grower, fills in an area very fast, but it grows a lot of areas where there's a lot of bog areas too. So it can take a lot of water. They call it a river fern because it can take floods, but then it can take the dry out after the floods. So I find ferns interesting in that they have been around for so many millions of years, and they've come closer to extinction just since man's got involved with them.
I have tiny ferns growing on my window trim outside. Are those ferns resurrection ferns? How would you know? I don't know.
Without seeing it, it would be hard for me to know for sure. Possible, not likely, just because they're very picky on what they grow on, but possible. I've actually seen one up here at the house. We had a trailer that we weren't like a U-Haul type trailer, not really flatbed, but anyway. And up around the metal part of the tongue, resurrection fern was growing. And it was like it caught into some of the rusty area there. And I guess it thought it was kind of like bark, and it got happy.
There you go. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of our chapter, and I thank you for coming. I will say that I'm totally impressed at your ability to rattle off all those genus species names. You did so well with that.
I appreciate it. They're changing all my names though, so I won't be able to do that next year. They'll all be a new name.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.